Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me this morning. We are running a session this morning for 45 minutes on social value for procurement and commissioners. Obviously, that's the target audience, but of course, anyone is always welcome to any of the Go for Growth webinars. As people are joining, I just want to say thank you, and we'll run through some introductions and do a bit of housekeeping. So we are on Zoom today. The chat functionality is enabled. You can ask questions through the Q&A functionality and also the chat. So I'll keep an eye on that as we go. I have seen, I think that we've just got somebody who might have put a hand up. Lucy, if you've got a question, please feel free to ask it. I've just unmuted you. No, okay, no worries. If anybody does want to put their hand up as we go through, please do feel free. We will take questions as we go. That's not a problem. Please do feel free to enter into any discussion on anything. We are just on 45 minutes today. We are going to be cantering through quite a lot at high level. So if you do want to have any deeper discussions at a later time, please do feel free to get in touch with me afterwards. The session is being recorded today, so a copy of the recording will come out to all registered attendees, along with a copy of the slide deck as well. So you will get everything that you see in the webinar this morning. I'm going to run through some basic introductions just to myself in a second. We'll overview social value, think about the procurement context specifically, and then actually finish up on how we might think about embedding social value through procurement and commissioning roles as we go. And then hopefully we'll have time for some questions at the end. But if we do run out of time, please put your questions in the chat and I will answer them when the slide deck comes out afterwards. So normally I would be joined by my colleague, Jimmy, but I'm not today. I'm flying solo. So I'm covering the bits that Jimmy would normally cover, and the procurement context will be covered by me also. I am a procurement professional by trade, 30 years in, and Jimmy and I are two of three co-founders of Go for Growth. We've been working in sustainable procurement for a long time. I've been in procurement for 30 years, and Jimmy is a social value expert. So that's who you've got today. So we're focusing on social value in procurement today, but this concept has really deep roots, actually, dating back to the Agenda 21. I don't know if anybody's heard of Agenda 21. It was developed by the United Nations and adopted in 1992 at the Earth Summit, and the name reflects its intent as the agenda for the 21st century. Over the years, though, it's really evolved. So shifting from corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility and private sector to broader themes like sustainability and sustainable development. And more recently, we've seen the rise of environmental, social and governance, ESG frameworks, as both the terminology itself and the approach, that structured approach to sustainability has continued to evolve. And that evolution has brought about a proliferation of terminology, which admittedly, and especially for the smaller businesses who aspire to work for the public sector, it hasn't always actually, this proliferation of terminology, it hasn't always actually made things clearer. However, at its core, the principles have remained consistent. And so whilst we're discussing social value today, it's important that we frame it within this longer historical and conceptual journey. So as we continue to discuss social value, it's important to recognise that while terminology might differ, the core principles remain the same. And it's about embedding sustainability in all that we do, considering the environmental, the social and the economic impacts of our actions, whether as an organisation or within our procurement processes. And what this slide aims to do is highlight how language often shapes our focus. So when we talk about social value, the emphasis tends to lean towards socio-economic outcomes. For instance, if you happen to be in a local authority, but this can apply to any public sector organisation or even in a business context, we might be asking ourselves, what are the social and economic value that's being created locally? On the other hand, sustainability as a term can often prioritise environmental considerations, placing the protection of the planet, for example, at the forefront, whilst integrating social and economic aspects alongside it. Either way, ultimately, whether we're framing these discussions around social value, sustainability, corporate responsibility, etc., the fundamental goal remains the same, and it's all about achieving a balance that addresses environmental, social, and economic priorities. And I think that's the key takeaway that we are trying to emphasize. I want to touch briefly on the broader context surrounding social value, which encompasses a wide range of interconnected issues, and we'll delve into a little detail on it. So one important framework to be aware of is the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. These 17 goals that you can see on the screen were established by the United Nations, and what they do is outline some of the key global challenges that we face, including things like poverty, hunger, gender equality, and climate action. But when the SDGs were first introduced, some bodies, organizations, people questioned their relevance in more developed countries, arguing that issues like hunger and poverty weren't as pressing as they might be in underdeveloped countries. However, I think what we all know is that arguing that issues like hunger and poverty aren't as pressing it's a non-argument. These challenges aren't confined to one region or one country. They exist across the globe, and they exist here in the UK as well. And in the context of social value, our roles as organisations is to contribute meaningfully towards addressing all of these challenges. And whilst actually we can't tackle necessarily all 17 goals simultaneously, what the SDGs do is provide a valuable framework for aligning our efforts with specific priorities that are relevant to our organisation, to our values, to our outcomes, but also to the procurement that we might be running. So whether it's through that procurement exercise, through a sustainability or an ESG strategy, for example, or those broader strategic organisational commitments, the SDGs remind us of the interconnected nature of these issues. Looking at the SDGs, admittedly, and especially again for smaller organisations, but I think this holds true for any organisation, when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals as a whole, they can feel overwhelming. But the key is to focus on where we can make the greatest impact, aligning with the organisation's social, economic, and environmental priorities. And this slide is a visual representation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and it highlights that interconnected nature that I'm talking about, structured across 3 layers. So environmental, the biosphere, we've then got social, the societal goals, and then the economic dimensions at the top. We often view the SDGs as a block of 17 discrete goals, almost in isolation of each other. But breaking them down in this way reinforces their holistic approach, and it also emphasises the need for partnership at every level, whether that's between countries, between businesses, between local authorities, between sustainability and procurement professionals. Collaboration is crucial to achieving these goals. And one key point on here is the foundational role of the environment. It's positioned at the base of the framework that you can see. And it reminds us about the vital importance of protecting that biosphere, as it underpins the whole ecosystem of services on which all societal and economic activities depend. And while the language of social value often draws focus towards those socio-economic outcomes, such as apprenticeships or local economic development, for example, it's essential to true delivery of social value in its broadest format. It's essential not to lose sight of the environmental dimension. So when we're considering social value in procurement, one of the things we need to do is actively seek opportunities to embed that environmental sustainability. And unlike social and economic factors, which can adapt and recover over time, the environment actually has finite limits that demand our urgent attention. And this is a busy slide, so forgive me, and you can look at it in more detail when the slide deck comes out. But one of the things, and my colleague Jimmy often gets this feedback shared with him, commissioners and procurement professionals often share a wide range of issues that we're expected to address through those professions, through the commissioning cycle and or the procurement cycle. So any new legislation or priorities, they tend to land on the procurement desk with the question, how are we embedding this into our procurement activities? whether that be modern slavery, carbon reduction, the ED&I, equality, diversity and inclusion agenda, risk mitigation, value for money, etc., etc., etc. The demands can often feel relentless. What this slide aims to do is illustrate this landscape of topics that could be included under the umbrella of social value. It's not exhaustive, by the way, this list, and not every issue will be relevant to every procurement exercise, whether that's for goods, services or works. However, it does give a sense of the complexity that we're navigating in sustainable procurement. So the challenge, as you can see it from here, and I've said it once already, it can quite quickly begin to feel overwhelming. But the key from a social value procurement perspective is how to acknowledge the full scope of those potential issues whilst distilling them down as to what is manageable, what's relevant, and ultimately what's going to be impactful within the context of that specific procurement or contract. So it's about recognizing the bigger picture, but then focusing on what truly matters for the tender that you're actually working on. So as we talk about social value and sustainability, they are fundamentally connected. You'll hear us repeat, Jimmy and I repeat this message over and over. Goal is to integrate into the commissioning processes by asking key questions. How can we reduce our environmental impact of the goods or services, works or projects that we are commissioning? How can we simultaneously enhance the social and economic value through those activities? And I've already said those environmental considerations are critical. They form the foundation of sustainability. So at the same time as thinking about those environmental considerations, we can also explore opportunities to create social and economic benefits. So every project, every tender, every commissioning decision should be approached by evaluating its environmental, social and economic impacts. From there, we can then focus on doing two things. So reducing the negative impacts of what we're doing, but also amplifying the positive outcomes over time. So this structured approach, identifying and minimizing negatives and maximizing the positives, that can help guide our activities and priorities effectively. And it's a process, certainly in our experience, that has proven invaluable for organizations who are striving to align their work with sustainable and socially valuable outcomes. And this slide highlights the connection between sustainability and social value at an organizational level. So every organization and project will come with some level of negative impact, often environmental, sometimes social and economic, particularly in terms of risk. So the question is, how can we effectively manage and reduce those negatives whilst maximising the positive contributions of our activities, whether that's through the procurement itself or through the broader organisation as well? And achieving that balance is definitely challenging. There's no two ways about it, but it is also essential that we aim to try and make that balance. And by applying a consistent methodology to every purchase, every project and every commission, what we then do is we systematically work towards reducing those negatives and enhancing those positives, such as the social contribution that we make, the financial value that we deliver, or the community benefits, for example. And if we're doing that in a systematic way, then there is a consistency and a sustainability in and of itself. And the balance that we're trying to achieve isn't necessarily just about addressing isolated issues like recycling, for example. It must be relevant to the subject matter of the contract and the opportunities that are being presented to the marketplace. And by focusing on that interplay between reducing harm and creating value, we can simplify that decision-making process whilst ensuring that we've got meaningful and measurable outcomes. So where do we focus our efforts? So one of the questions that we get a lot is, actually, this is huge. I don't know where to start. The marketplace feed that back to us, as do procurement and commissioning colleagues. So we've tried to highlight, or I've tried to highlight up to press the broader context, including the global challenges represented by the Sustainable Development Goals. Those global issues, they form what we call our sphere of concern. So things that we need to be aware of, but which might lie beyond our direct ability to solve as individual organisations or even through specific projects. So whilst we acknowledge these larger scale issues, our primary focus should be where we can make a difference. So that brings us to our sphere of influence, the areas where we can exert meaningful impact, whether that's through the procurement and commissioning process or the broader organisation. This sphere is defined even by factors such as the subject matter of the contract, the budget, the opportunities available, the marketplace capability, capacity, those kind of things, and about the opportunities for impact that are available. So it's about asking ourselves, what can we influence through this particular project or procurement? And that then takes us finally to our sphere of control. So these are the aspects that we can directly address and act upon today. And for every project, it's essential to evaluate the environmental, the social, and the economic impacts and opportunities, and then choose the most relevant and achievable steps. And we acknowledge actually that we can't solve every challenge at once, but by taking intelligent and focused action within our sphere of control, we can create positive change. And this is the narrative that we build on as an organisation, understanding the bigger picture, recognising our limitations, and then focusing our efforts where they matter most. So these actions might be small to start with, not always economic either. They might be environmental or social. They might take years actually to fully materialise. But maintaining that focus is the key to driving real impact over time. So in a procurement context, social value is becoming increasingly more important to the public sector. It's been around in terms of legislation since 2012. It was assented to law in January 2013, the Social Value Act, the Public Services Act of 2012. So it's not new. It's not a new concept in terms of legislation, and it's not a new concept to procurement. And what's it trying to achieve? So in its basic form, the Public Services Act is trying to help direct spending towards achieving those wider social, economic and environmental goals that, if we've worked through the steps that we've just chatted through, will be in our sphere of control, and we'll be thinking about our direct impact and the things that we can focus on and actually make change on. And the Public Services Act is effectively a legislative framework that wraps around that to help drive us. And it aims to really instill in that public spend environment that it's about achieving value for money, and whatever that definition might mean. So rather than focusing on the narrow costs of a contract, we're factoring in the social, environmental and economic impacts across the broader, longer term value, and how that might change the procurement decisions that we make and the commissioning decisions that we make. And it helps us fulfill policy decisions, obligations around issues like inequality, community development, climate change, for example. And considering that social value as part of our procurement, it places the duty, or the legislation places the duty on public bodies to consider at pre-procurement stages how services and goods that are being commissioned and procured can actually physically go on to improve social, environmental and economic well-being. And taking into account social value, we've seen the evidence of this. It can actually improve supplier relationships. It can improve reputations of commissioning organisations, because it really focuses on that commitment to using procurement budgets and organisational budgets, public money in this context, in the most responsible, ethical and sustainable way. And I don't know of those on the call what you're experiencing individually, but we're seeing weightings between, on average, I would guess 10%, some as high as 20%. And what that means to the marketplace is, it is now true to say, I think, that social value can be bid winning. And that also means, therefore, that it can be bid losing. And the Procurement Act legislation that's due to go live next month on the 24th has a real emphasis, I think, on social value, flexibility, transparency. They're golden threads that run through, and the Act is, I believe, really trying to modernise procurement processes. The Act, as you would expect, aims to having contracting authorities act with integrity, treat suppliers equitably, and promote a fair and green and innovative procurement process. And that whole thing about meet to mat, so the most economically advantageous tender, shifting to most advantageous tender, is really reinforcing that message that what value for money looks like should be, in part at least, thinking about those broader considerations of environmental, social and economic, and not just fiscal considerations. Furthermore, the transparency regime, I think, in the Procurement Act, throughout that whole procurement life cycle, including things like the contracting authority being required to publish supplier performance information, it really aligns with the broader objective of ensuring that public procurement positively contributes to society and the broader economy. So the procurement context and the National Procurement Policy Statement specifically, we don't have it yet. So we will have the new version as the legislation comes into force. I think what we'll see in there won't be a massive departure from what we've had before. We will, I'm sure, see the priorities of a mission-driven government reflected in the National Procurement Policy Statement. I don't know how many people went through the consultation process that was there. But, you know, the National Procurement Policy Statements have always underpinned things like creating resilience in businesses, opportunities for quality employment, skills development, increasing innovation, supply chain resilience, security of supply, tackling climate change and reducing waste, etc. I think we'll see those things reflected in some way, shape or form in the new National Procurement Policy Statement. In the mission-driven government information that you can find on gov.uk, there's a lot around supporting small businesses and sole traders, and it runs as a golden thread throughout the Procurement Act in terms of small to medium enterprises, and they are the backbone of our economy. And so it's vital that contracting authorities support businesses to achieve sustainable growth and open up those public procurement opportunities to more SMEs and the voluntary community and social enterprise and not-for-profit sector, so that we can create this thriving, competitive, local marketplace. And SMEs is a part of that social value consideration. So when we are allowing SMEs to access opportunities or being inclusive and open for business, we are achieving social value. It is part of our social value delivery, and SMEs play a key role in communities by providing a local service. They also, I think, offer a key to innovation in public service delivery. And so levelling the playing field for SMEs and VCSE startups, sole traders, etc., to compete in public procurement by reducing and removing those barriers to access will be a key element of what we do in social value going forward. So if we think about removing barriers for a second to entry and growth for SMEs, what can we tangibly do? I won't talk through all of them, but I will just pick out a couple. So the more you talk to the marketplace, the better, and the better equipped we'll be as procurers and commissioners to know how our specification will be met in the market. So understanding the capacity and the capability of the marketplace. The marketplace tells us that more is more. So we know things change. We know they can change on a pin, actually. We know budgets can be thrown in at the last minute. They can also be cut at the last minute. But the more you can talk to the marketplace, the better. Some of the new constructs under the Procurement Act will be challenging for some of the marketplace, at least, like the competitive flexible procedure, the open framework and dynamic markets. They're new constructs, and so we will have to support the marketplace to get up to speed. The other thing I would touch on is pipelines. So the Procurement Act says that we need to publish pipelines above 2 million. If you're being accessible to a smaller marketplace, that's going to be below threshold, those opportunities. Your local, smaller organisations will be in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands. So we would encourage you to think about actually what level you go down to in terms of that pipeline publication. And for smaller organisations who still need the time to prepare, as everybody else do, how much information can you give them? And if you haven't already, we did an iGov survey about 18 months ago with YPO. We polled 150 buyers. 30% of those respondents said they weren't clear on what the spend to SMEs were in their organisation. If you can then baseline your spend to smaller organisations, you'll then know, what your progress is looking like over time. through Go for Growth, we think we're seeing a 70% increased engagement with competitions, and that's resulting in a 30% increase in business being awarded to SMEs, and the smaller end of that SME definition. So having that baseline will be useful. And it's not all about direct engagement, of course. This applies to tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, where you've got principal contractors and subcontractors, and flowing that desire for accessibility, transparency, flexibility, etc., through those big principal contracts so that you can see the localization agenda in that subcontracting. Often tier 1 organisations will do some work locally. Also, often they will work with organisations that they want to work with or that they've worked with before. And as a private sector organisation, of course, they can do that. What that means is, for us as procurement practitioners, there's an onus and a responsibility on the commissioning organisation at the top of that family tree to make sure that contractually that it flows through to local, VCSE, small businesses, etc., to capitalise on that. Just going to see if we, I think I saw that we might have had a question come in. Let me have a look. Yeah, so the question that we've had says, given the financial challenges facing public bodies, concerned that goods will continue to be prioritised by price. It is a concern. I think it's a concern that's shared by lots of us. However, the Act at least is trying to engender that isn't the case, that it isn't the fastest race to the bottom, and it isn't always going to be the lowest price that wins. Where that cost fiscal consideration is the value for money objective, then that will continue. But the whole encouragement is of the broader social, environmental and economic considerations. So it will take time. It isn't new. We are moving in the right direction, but it's a concern that we'll need to see how we go, I think, as we work through. I wanted to bring up climate emergency as a specific topic. It is part of social value, those environmental considerations that we talked about being that foundational layer of what we do. And you'll see on screen, so over 300 local authorities have declared climate emergency. 91% of all London boroughs have declared climate emergency. The NHS has declared a climate emergency as a health emergency and is actively working towards becoming the world's first net zero health service. And we've got the same in blue light and in education. And so my question to the commissioners and the procurers on the call is, you will no doubt, if you're one of those organisations who is thinking about climate change, who is thinking about climate emergency, carbon net zero, or has declared climate emergency, you will absolutely, without doubt, be thinking about your scopes 1 and 2, and you'll probably be thinking about your scope 3. Scope 3 can often be up to 80–90% of all an organisation's emissions, and it's a volume market because your purchased goods and services are in there. So the question is, how are you supporting low carbon transition in your supply chain and in your local business and VCSE community? How can carbon net zero help you engage that marketplace on your doorstep? We can help with that in Go for Growth. I'm not going to cover it today, but we do have a very specific programme that's focusing on scope 3 emissions. So if anybody would like to chat more about it, about our carbon net zero programme, please do either head to our website or give me a shout afterwards. But thinking about climate emergency as a very specific subset of the broader environmental considerations is often where lots of organisations are. And what we know at the minute is the legislation says over 5 million value contracts, you must have a carbon reduction plan. But we're seeing that really be drilled down lower into lower value contracts. Some contracts are saying that you don't need one as part of the bid, but if we ask to see it, you should have it. And given in the UK, there are 5.5 million businesses, 99.3 of them would be classified as small, that's 0 to 49 employees. This volume market it's like a super tanker. It has to go on a consistent and systematic journey if we're going to achieve net zero. We have to go through our supply chain. We have to get that super tanker to turn. So it's an area that we probably can't afford not to focus tangibly on in the future if we're not already. So thinking about embedding social value, and then I'll open up for some questions. I've broken this down into 3 stages. So the pre-procurement stage, again, I'm not going to go through everything on screen, but I'm going to pick out a few things. So understanding the organization's sustainability goals, aligning those to the sustainable development goals, the SDGs, can be a really useful exercise to do as an organization if you haven't done it already. And playing into that, an understanding of the whole life cycle of sustainability. How long will it take to buy? How long will a contract run for? What happens at the end of that? Does the end of the contract also mean the end of life for those goods or those services? What does that life, look like from a sustainability perspective? And if you were doing a sustainability life cycle, would that be different from a total cost of ownership life cycle? How do the two interplay? Understand the market dynamics. So what has the market got to offer? It plays into the Procurement Act's focus on pre-procurement engagement. What's the maturity and the appetite for sustainability? If you think about different markets, so think about the garmentry market versus construction market and the maturity of those sectors. Not every sector will be in the same place from a sustainability maturity perspective. And so we have a responsibility as procurers and commissioners to help develop that marketplace and mature that marketplace at a rate that they can cope with. And that all sort of comes out of understanding the benefits. What are we trying to achieve here? So we're in our sphere of control. What can we actually impact if we understand what our goals are, if we understand the market dynamics? What can we actually achieve? What are the benefits that we can deliver? How will this project sustainability goals? What's the art of the possible? How will we achieve it? How far can we push those things? And then actually on a really practical basis, before we actually get into the process, thinking about the technical evaluation for sustainability, it should be part of the core requirement, not tagged on to the end. I'm seeing it less so now, but we still see social value as being unscored sometimes. So what we're saying to the marketplace is it's not important enough to give it a weighting, but we still want it. And that's a mixed message. That's not necessarily the message that we want to go out. It should be sustainable procurement is the only procurement in town. We have embedded all of this because it's all as important as the financial outcomes of any procurement competition. And in the sourcing stage, if we think about that sustainability criteria in the selection stages, the evaluation stages, thinking about what proportional due diligence might look like for those selected suppliers, making sure that the criteria is inclusive and compliant both with regulations and competition law. Is it proportionate? Is it relevant? Will it help us achieve the impact that we think we've identified in our sphere of control? Making sure that our evaluation is robust, and that evaluation can really ensure that the solution that you end up buying will meet your sustainability needs. So look for those sustainability commitments. What we're not looking for is lip service, and we need to be aware of greenwashing. My colleague and I, when we teach category management, when we teach social value contract management, we are always talking about if someone's telling you they're planting trees, you need to see the trees, because there is a chance that it's the same 100 trees that are planted for every contract. And so actually we're being greenwashed. There's an overstating of the sustainability commitment and the impact that we'll get out of it. And that will mean that we need to do some due diligence in this sourcing stage that allows us to validate those claims from the supplier, and especially if social value is going to be the differentiator between who wins and who loses. And obviously that takes us into implementation. So, and often in organisations, contract management could sit separately to sourcing and procurement, and that can often sit separately from commissioning. So making sure that we're thinking about all of those parts of the cycle as we go through it. How do we ensure that whoever wins actually deliver on what they say they're going to do, testing those claims, holding the supplier to account in a very positive and respectful way, but making sure that actually we are delivering the impact that we identified in that sphere of control. And ultimately what that means is we're making sure that we get the contract that we awarded, and that's what gets implemented, including all of the sustainability considerations as well. And in that final stage, and you know, my procurement colleagues on the call will no doubt agree with this, in part at least. Contract management is often where the battle is won and lost in terms of actually bringing to life the impact and outcomes of the procurement project that we've just run. So we're thinking about the implementation then of the goods, the services, the works. How does that initial mobilization, deployment, implementation, how does that work so that we actually embed what we wanted to embed? Those sustainability practices that we've embedded in the specification, that we've questioned through evaluation, they've got to be enduring through the life of the contract. So how do we do that? How do we make sure that the administrative burden that comes with that is relevant and proportionate, and then we're not tying anybody, including ourselves, up in an administrative ball of knots with massive measurement regimes that actually don't get us anywhere? How do we make sure that all of that really works? And are we seeing our suppliers live a sustainable business? What's our side of the relationship in that? How do we contract manage those responsibilities and behaviours in our supply chain? How do we achieve these sustainability objectives together? How do we use contract management and supplier relationship management to actually go on a collaborative journey towards sustainability delivery? And we think about the circular economy in those life cycles. So when we're thinking about the end of the contract, what does that mean to end of life? If you are looking at your tech procurement, for example, you might, if you were thinking about circular economy, you might choose to lease tech as opposed to buy tech. And then actually you've got that circular reuse as opposed to recycle almost embedded in your procurement from the beginning. So what are the options that are built into the contract? What are our future plans for the assets or the services that we've procured? And how will we performance measure this stuff? How will we know that we got what we were intending to get? And if we didn't, how do we know why not? What happened? What changed? Is this a contract management issue, or has the world moved on and something else has happened? If you imagine a global pandemic dropping on our doorstep in 2020, the world just changed shape, and some of the outcomes that we were intending to get out of procurements just were no longer possible. So if we think about those performance measures, what are they actually telling us, and how reliable is the data that we're getting back from it? And so on screen, and this will come out in your slide pack, there are just 5 things that you can take away and potentially action to move social value forward in your organisation. Aligning your procurement goals with the sustainable development goals, embedding social value right from that pre-planning stage, and ideally even before procurement planning in that commissioning cycle. So when we're thinking about specifying the goods and services that we need, thinking about sustainability right at that very first stage. And then actually supporting the local marketplace, your supply chain, your local businesses, to reduce carbon and to manage that wider environmental biosphere layer where we know it's the foundation of everything that we do. Measuring and monitoring the impact that we're having. We're working in our sphere of control. We know what we can directly impact. Did the contract procurement project, whatever it is, did we achieve those impacts? How are we able to monitor it? And easily accessible monitoring. And then that collaboration, we talked about it in the 3 stages. It is absolutely critical that we collaborate at each part of this, internally as commissioners, procurers, contract managers, collaboratively with the marketplace, with our suppliers, etc. So forgive me. But also creating forums that share best practice in achieving social value and drawing on those principles of transparency and collaboration. It's really, really important that we do as much of that as we can. And so that was it from me this morning. I will stop sharing my screen and I'll double check if we've got any questions in the Q&A. We've got nothing in there at the moment and nothing in chat. What you will get in the slide deck is my contact details and my colleague Jimmy's contact details if you do want to chat to either us about social value, economic value, and of course the environmental considerations, including carbon net zero. Please do just give us a shout. We are here to try and help as much as we can. Do we have any examples of social value measures for evaluation? Yes, we do actually. We're pulling together, we wouldn't call them templates, to be fair, but just some examples of how you might do it. Part of the problem, I guess, is social value is very subjective. So if we think about our sphere of control and our sphere of influence, they will be different from organisation to organisation. But we are definitely pulling together some guidances, resources that hopefully would be helpful around that. There's a question on who is social value meant to benefit, the customer or the community? Largely, I think part of what you're doing in your scoping is answering one of those questions. So who is this the benefit for? If you're thinking about community benefit, then the answer would be the community. The end user is a customer. So it might be the service user or, an end user in the local environment that it benefits for. Part of that scoping process is, what are those outcomes and who are those outcomes for? What is the impact and who will be impacted? And can we see it? Can we touch it? Can we feel it? Can we measure it? And how do we know if we got there? So there's no right and wrong answer to that, because social value is subjective. If you're a local authority in Yorkshire, one of their core principles in social value is to decrease food poverty in their local authority area. So almost all of their procurements have got a nod to reducing poverty, reducing hunger, which are two of the SDGs. And what they do then is tailor, thinking about that's one of our overarching social principles. If I'm buying X, what is my sphere of control? How can I directly impact? Who am I directly impacting? And how can I embody that in this procurement project? And how can I ask the right questions,